Hello, everybody. It's January 15th. This is Public Affairs, Public Access. I'm Paul Colby. Some of you may know me. In fact, probably the ones who are watching this program do know me, and that's why they've tuned in tonight. But if not, hello to my old friends as well as my new friends. Some of you may know that I am a political scientist by education, and a perennial presidential candidate, have been for maybe the last 7 or 8 election cycles. And so often you hear me just ventilate and or view the landscape of current American politics, or talk about all of the other things that filter into my many complicated perceptions of life in 3D. So this is going to be another episode of that sort. We're past the presidential elections, and tonight I'm going to do a little roadmap for you of where I think I'm going to go with this discussion. I do want to talk about politics, and that's where I'm going to start, and that's going to be mostly some reminiscences. Then I'm going to talk about metaphysics and my metaphysical education, and I'm going to more or less summarize in a few nuggets everything I learned over 25 or 30 years of studying diligently in many areas of metaphysics. And then I'm going to move on, and I'm going to talk about the intersection of politics and metaphysics. And after I do that and come to some alarming conclusions, or maybe they'll be very pleasant for you to digest, then I'm going to move into an area called smoke screens. I'm going to talk about synthetic events and how reality, as most people perceive it, has nothing to do with what's actually going on. And then when I'm finished with that, assuming that I haven't already used up 2 hours and 45 minutes, I'm going to make a comment or two about possible futures. Does that sound interesting? Well, it sounds pretty interesting to me, and I'm not even sure what I'm going to say yet, but I have some ideas. First of all, let's talk about politics. I'm long a student of politics, and as a matter of fact, my major is in political science. So you know I must be interested, because with a major in political science, there's not very much you can do other than teach political science, or branch out, go to law school, or if you were debating in high school or college, then probably you took political science because it was already something that you were studying as you debated many and various policy topics over the years. Politics, of course, is about the art and science of governance, if you want my definition. But it's part art and part science. And I have always been interested from the first perceptions I have of the TV era, which was black and white in those days, of people who were in charge of the affairs of others. And specifically, I was interested in the proper role of government. And you know, politics really is a study which describes how we treat one another and how we treat people other than our own countrymen. I think those are the animating forces there. We have principles that guide our particular form of government and our politics, which for all intents and purposes is the #1 religion in America and always has been. America, if there's any place on earth that deserves to be called such, is the country where politics is the religion, or I'm going to qualify that, has been up to this point, because a new age is dawning all over the place, which includes here, and some of that is changing. Now, I always thought it was important to remember that we have a democracy, because following the lineage of the Greek culture and the earliest experiments with a form of government that respects the will of the people, obviously it's paramount that we have, or ought to have, a government that reflects the wishes, the intentions, the needs of the populace. But we also have a republic, and a republic means that we're ruled by laws. So it's interesting that in America, you want to have democracy, and you also want to have the rule of law, because when you're a person who is in the minority viewpoint at a particular point in time on a particular question, you want to know that your basic rights are protected, that you do have basic rights that are going to be there notwithstanding changes in the political climate. Because if there's one thing we can be sure of, looking back over 100 years of American history, and more than that, but let's just take 100, because there's not anybody around here watching tonight who really has a memory that's longer than that, right? Anyway, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, those were sort of like the core values that all the structure of government and all the administration of government and all of the activities of government are supposed to hinge upon. They're supposed to be, in that purposive, driven sense of what are we after, all the activities of government should be about protecting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or far left or far right or a vegetarian or a libertarian, or there's bound to be a few more, you have certain rights in this democracy. And I always thought that was especially important to consider as people try to, let's say, whittle away at those rights. Because those of you who have studied political science and studied history and who are aware of current events know that over the long course of the post-war era, many of the things that used to be our freedoms are now sort of qualified freedoms, and a lot of things that we used to just let happen and deal with, now we have big government dealing with or pretending to deal with or claiming that it is actually trying to deal with when it might be doing something else. And in this discussion I'm making here about politics, I think that people on either side of any equation, when there's a conservative position and a liberal position, for example, people, when they look at individual issues, are motivated by one or two things. First of them would be what they think is right. And maybe that's gone out of fashion to some extent these days, because the right is kind of a gray area, but I like it that way anyway. If they're not motivated by what they think is right, then they're motivated by their self-interest, or, important to put it in these terms, their perception of their self-interest. Because the amazing thing about politics is that many people in America are deluded into going along with certain things or approving of certain programs or approving of some approaches to problems because they think it's in their best interest, not because it really is. They've been led to believe that it is, or through the techniques of modern advertising and subliminal persuasion and all that's been studied in the way of getting people to do certain things that they should or shouldn't, or in the absence of these manipulative techniques would or wouldn't do. Well, this about says it. People are led into a belief that something that has been proposed by their government in response to usually some sort of crisis is good for them, or it's at least the best thing that we can do. You see the manipulation of the populace in terms of fear, i.e., there's us versus them, there's these enemies, there's these problems, and even though we want to be free to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we have to amend that because we also have to be safe. So more and more, as people consider themselves living in a dangerous world, a dangerous universe, they do concede certain powers to the government, thinking that it's best, if they be secure, that somebody else be in charge of it, and certain rights therefore become conditional. Certain opportunities for behavior even become conditional, and the ability to associate with whoever you want and to study whatever you want and to travel wherever you want and to, be freewheeling, that kind of gets curtailed when the public policy manipulates by tactics of invoking fear and the need for protection, and some of our liberty, some of our pursuit of happiness gets pretty minimized in that context. Now, all of that being said, I started out in my political life as sort of a Democrat because they seemed to be activists to me at one time in life, but it was never a cut and dry proposition. For example, I remember that one of the early heroes was General Eisenhower when he was president, because on his way out of office, he warned us about the dangers of an increasingly growing and powerful military-industrial complex. And much of the turbulence that happened in the period of the 60s, where all sorts of social and political institutions were radically modified, came out of a response by people like myself who were very active and very concerned about the power of the military-industrial complex. And in those days, the covert activities of the Central Intelligence Agency. Me and a bunch of people who were going to college at the time had no problem with intelligence. We just didn't think that most of the covert operations that were being undertaken by our government were very intelligent. And in fact, almost none of them had anything to do with protecting freedom or liberty for us or for the persons in other countries where covert operations were being conducted. They seemed instead, and we know this to be true, and you can look at 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 examples and you'll come to the same conclusion every time, that basically in that day and to this day, the CIA was basically a private army for the Fortune 500, taking care of making the world safe, not for democracy, but for big corporations. And in the days that I'm referring to there, the turbulent 60s, many things got exposed, and they even seem to be changed to some extent in the period of the church committee hearings in the 70s. This was like after all of the upset of the 60s and after all of the dirty laundry got shown. But in point of fact, most of those abuses being conducted in our name and for the benefit of large corporations didn't actually end then. They just changed names or changed focus or were carried out by different agencies than the CIA, et cetera, et cetera. So all of the issues that animated my political life when I was younger continue in some form up to this very day. And therefore, my political leanings have remained pretty much in the same direction, even though, as I look at both major parties, the differences between them have become, rather less striking. Both sides of the Republican-Democrat struggle that goes on forever here have grown so used to taking money that the entire political process has been corrupted and suffered dramatically, because when big money is talking, it's not really talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's talking about corporate profits. So, am I a Democrat? Well, some of the time I vote for Democrats, but some of my ideas have as much to do with Republican or conservative thinking or libertarian thinking as they do with democratic thinking. And in that sense, I think I'm like most of the population in that I decide things on the basis of particular issues, and in things like presidential elections, I decided on the basis of the person who's running. And it generally tends to end up that the Democrat is not as bad as the Republican, but there's very few actual races that I can think of over the years that I embraced with full enthusiasm. In the earliest days, one of the things that most inspired me and that was part of John F. Kennedy's inaugural address was the concept of making the world safe for diversity. And diversity is one thing that over the course of the last 50 years has been pretty much squashed and is crumbling under the weight of globalization, which is making all of the world into either markets or cheap areas to produce things. So, one of my largest political crusades over the years in my own presidential campaign and in discussion with others has been about the fact that corporations are not people and they shouldn't have more rights than people, and that the bottom line in any political system is supposed to be about human and other values. Human and other meaning that there are other species on this planet that are equally sentient, if in a different way, and it's about those sentient organisms and groupings of organisms that we ought to conduct the business of government in such a way that it maximizes their potential to have an agreeable life. Corporations, on the other hand, they're not people, and they're always going to be motivated primarily by profit because that's what they are. They're profit-making entities. So, I have a great respect for diversity. I have a great respect for using government to encourage and to support values that have to do with living organisms. And therefore, from the standard viewpoint, you could say that politics is about a struggle. And I recall one of my earliest professors in college teaching political science telling all of us that politics was about scarcity. In other words, if resources were absolutely unlimited, then it's unlikely that we would have many of the conflicts that we have these days, because everybody would have everything and nobody would have the perception that they need to get something that somebody else has, or that there's only so much of this and we need it all. That's especially appropriate to consider when you realize, and most of you do realize, that here in this country we consume a gigantic proportion of the world's resources, and we aren't really a gigantic number of the population of the globe. You know, it's going to fluctuate, but we can use that 25, 75 number pretty much down the line here to cover what we're talking about, using 75% of the planet's resources for 25% of the people, give or take those numbers. And all of that being said, the perception you have when you're a political animal is that you fight the good fight, and that you stand up for what is right, and that you address your causes. And no matter what side of any issue you're on, and what your basic orientation is, whether you're a liberal or conservative, then you're probably motivated at some core level to either address things that you think are unjust and need to be righted, or you're going after your self-interest. You're doing the things that make your life comfortable and agreeable. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? The only other thing that I want to say as an aside, when we talk about the turbulent 60s as one of my earliest reference points, and going through the 70s and all the upheaval that happened then, is that as a person who is also an artist and a thinker and a lot of other things besides, I realized that it wasn't the political system that resulted in all of the monumental changes that happened at that stage in the country's history. It was more forces outside of politics, like rock and roll music, like the Beatles, like well, that pretty much covers it. Things outside of the political mainstream, and therefore, while politics is a solution to a lot of problems, many times politics is the arena where things get formulated and finalized that have already been demanded by the rest of the culture, and in the political system, they just have to kind of catch up with where the public sentiment is, except for the factors we've already mentioned, which is to distract people with bogus threats so that they think about being safe instead of thinking about living productive and happy lives. So that's how I got educated as a political person, and every time a presidential election comes along or some other local or state election where I think it's important, I will do some work, and I will go for the guy or the gal that I think has the best chance of doing something constructive for the lot of us, and I will oppose those things which I think are unjust or which are based on avarice and greed or which are illegal. For example, like most of what the last administration did for the last 8 years. That gives you a whole lot to work with when you're a political animal, but I want to stop talking about that now and start talking about what I learned from metaphysics. Because a number of years ago, I decided I didn't want to work all the time. Instead, I wanted to just follow my instinct to study things. And so I guess that's about 30 or 35 years ago or something like that. I immersed myself in all kinds of metaphysical literature, metaphysical training from various quarters, and learned a lot of things over a long period of time from a lot of different people. Metaphysics is about first principles, and the essence of what I learned from metaphysics is a little different from what I learned when I was thinking in political terms. Many people in recent years have become aware of the video presentation and book called The Secret, which basically examines the law of attraction and explains how just about anybody who applies themselves can do whatever it is that they want to do. The secret isn't really a secret, though. Most of the material that's in that presentation came from the work of the channeled collective entity Abraham that Esther Hicks has been channeling for 25 or 30 years. And in fact, most of the material that Abraham delivers was delivered a generation before that in the Seth books that Jane Roberts wrote. And at the core level, almost all of the best metaphysical material will take you down to just a few rules about what it's like to be in a physical reality and what it is that you can do in a physical reality. Essentially, they all say that you create your own reality and that the present is the point of power and that you get what you concentrate on. That's the way Seth put it a long time ago. When Abraham talks about it, they refer to the law of attraction, and they say that that which is likened to itself is drawn. They talk about allowing. They talk about the natural stream of good energy that is part of the universe and why people resist it to their detriment. So, years ago when I discovered the notion that you create your own reality, it didn't take very long to figure out that that's how it worked, especially when you look at things that you're proud to have accomplished or things that began as some nascent desire and turned into a long quest, things that produced results that were based on some fleeting thought. In all of the cases where you did something successful or something that made you happy, you're quite willing to say, yes, I created that. The hang-up is that most people, when they discover the notion that you create your own reality, it flies in the face of what they think they know from common sense, which is that life is about what happens to you. Life and all of these events that you aren't particularly pleased about are things that you have no control over. They just happen to you. It takes a while to reorient the personality to realize that you have divine energy running through you and that you do in fact create everything that happens to you, everything in your experience. The problem is most people create by default. And since they create by default, it is fair to say that just knowing that you create your own reality doesn't mean that you always get what you want. Until you learn the rules of how you create your own reality, then you can continue to be creating things that aren't what you want. This is largely because of that premise that you get what you concentrate on. It doesn't much matter if you're concentrating on something that you want or something that you don't want. The universe basically delivers it to you, whatever it is. Your dominant thought pattern, your dominant intention, the way that you mostly think about things, the habits of thought that you have, absolutely and completely are mirrored in your experience. And in your metaphysical training, once you get the notion very clear, all you have to do is look at your experience and the things that go on in your life, and it's very easy to tell what you believe. That's why, for example, positive affirmations can be useful or not useful. If you're making an affirmation about something and you don't really believe it, it isn't going to do very much good. You can tell what you really believe, and in this 3D environment, what you get, what you create, is what you expect to create. If you hope for something, but you don't think you can get it, then your reality is going to exactly show you that. So the process of changing your reality, knowing what the rules are, and any of you can find this, you can look at The Secret, but you can look at a whole treasure trove of books. Once you start changing your reality, then you can make sweeping changes in your life. And the important thing about it is that doesn't depend on what's going on outside. As a practical matter, the reason that most people don't make changes in their life that they really want is that they spend most of their time looking at what is. And if you spend all of your time looking at what is, then you produce more of what is. You have to learn to imagine what you want, not what you see in front of you by way of evidence. And a corollary to this that you learn as you study metaphysics is that there is not a reality that is true that you have to figure out. The fact is, if you put 55 people in a room or in an outdoor setting and they observe an event, you're going to have 55 different interpretations of what happened. And we all share a collective mass consciousness reality to a considerable extent, i.e. the sun usually rises in the morning for all of us. But within that context, people experience a completely different reality sharing the very same physical universe. And what that means is you can create a bubble reality regardless of what is going on in the external environment, because you create for you and you create in your localized, very personal environment, notwithstanding whether the economy is on the way up, whether people are being very kind to each other, whether a hurricane came through town and knocked down most of the houses except for yours, etc. You got my point. You can live in a bubble reality, and I got to tell you folks, been doing that for 30 or 40 years, and it doesn't really matter what's going on outside. Once you get the idea that you create your reality, there are going to be other people in your instant environment creating much less satisfying realities, working with the same raw materials. Now, that says you don't face reality unless reality happens to look exactly like you want it to. Instead, you imagine a different reality if that's what it is. What this is all saying is that basically you're all gods, you're all divine. That stream of energy that comes directly from Source runs through all of you. And one thing that means is that in reality, there aren't any victims. That's really hard for some people to take, because the fact is that as divine entities who decide to have the experience of being in human bodies, if you've been there, done that, done everything, from the entity's perspective, there can be certain circumstances for learning and circumstances for adventure that don't seem very interesting to you or very pleasing to you as a human, but sounded pretty interesting to look at as an entity. Entities basically like to come into bodies because they get to experience the illusion of death, they get to experience sexuality, they get to experience learning how to create at a much more rapid rate than they do when they're outside of physical form. Because when you're outside of physical form, you think it and it's there. There's no challenge to that. You imagine a brand new solar system, and before you even finish imagining it, there it is. You come here to have the time-lapse perspective of watching how things are created, and everything here, am I repeating that? Everything here is divine. Everything here is God. That means that in reality, there are not any victims. But until someone is awakened to who they really are, then they can certainly have their life circumstances present them a picture that suggests to them that they are a victim. I'm saying they can transform that once they realize how it works, but until and unless they get that insight, yes, they can still have the experience of being a victim. That is part of the metaphysical perspective, and the other things to add to that is that I could add 5 or 6 hours to that, but I would say that from that perspective, what physicists would call probable event, everything that could have happened in any set of circumstances where there was a choice and another choice, excuse me, in some reality has happened. And you can connect with anything that you want to happen, because somewhere in the physical universe or a different one, it already has happened. And so you have basically unlimited power here once you learn that it's not you that does it, it's the divine part of you that does it. So, having said that, the metaphysical animal in me has been very pleased for quite a number of years, notwithstanding what goes on outside there in the political arena, whether it's good from my standpoint or bad from my standpoint. It doesn't really affect my reality very much anymore. And so that leads me into this discussion, as I say, of the intersections of politics and metaphysics. And the primary one, as I say, is that your reality isn't dependent on any of those factors out there in the big bad world. You can live a totally blissful, abundant, totally productive, totally satisfying, totally exciting life, no matter what. And it's your right to do so. And as a practical matter, it is the most inspirational thing you can do to help any other sentient being on the planet. They learn more by the example of you prospering and growing and showing your divinity and your unlimited power than by anything else. Now, sometimes, if they're hungry, you might want to feed them, but the most important thing you can do is to show them that they also are divine. It's from this metaphysical perspective intersecting with politics that we also understand why what people resist tends to persist. It's from this perspective that we understand that it is much, much more powerful to believe in something than to fight against something. Because remember, you get what you concentrate on. If you think back to the re-election, not this one, but the second term of George Bush, there were a whole lot of people who during that campaign had the slogan, "Anybody but Bush." And ultimately we had Kerry running against Bush. But remember, from the metaphysical standpoint and from the study of the brain, there are things we can learn. And one of those is that the brain doesn't hear things like knots, and it doesn't do the same sort of thing that you think it's going to do when you give it an instruction. Many people spend a lot of time, for example, trying to not smoke, but the brain doesn't hear not, it just hears what you're repeating over and over, smoke. Not smoke, it just hears smoke. Don't walk under the ladder, it hears walk under the ladder. It focuses on your dominant thought. It works in pictures, it works in kinesthetic realms. It doesn't work the same way the ego part of the brain that's spinning constantly all the time works. So, a lot of people fight against the things that they don't like. And as a political animal, I still do that sometimes, but I understand that in the main, what you do is focus by looking at the contrast and knowing what you don't want, you focus then on what it is that the preferred alternative is, and that's where all of your energy is supposed to go. The more you focus on things that aren't correct, that aren't the way you want them, the more you just keep producing the same effect. It also is important to note two things that tie back to my early discussion about politics. One of those is about safety, because we have been bamboozled into thinking that when the government takes away a bunch of our individual liberties to fight a war on terror, that we're somehow safer. Well, most of you can look at the evidence and know we're not any safer, that we've created a world where we're even more hated, where we are killing more people, mostly innocent civilians, where we are locking up people who aren't guilty of anything, thereby causing hatred that will last for generations, if not hundreds of years, because of stupid actions. And we all, well, some of us anyway, bought into it because of the idea of fear, and we want to be safe. Well, once you get to a certain metaphysical understanding, you realize you're safe regardless. When you're safe, there's nothing you need to protect yourself from. As long as you believe that the universe is a dangerous place and you fall for that, then nothing that anybody does is going to be enough protection. This is very important. You can certainly look at the universe, the physical universe that we would agree about as a consensus reality, and you can say it's a dangerous place. But from your metaphysical intersection with that, you can say that you live in a safe universe. Not that the whole universe is safe, but that you live in a safe universe. People laugh at me when I don't lock my doors, but I know when I need to lock the door. And that doesn't mean I would never lock the door. But if I need to lock the door, my well-honed intuitive sense now tells me that I need to lock the door. You can live without fear. You can live through natural disasters. You can be the one house on the block that's spared when some natural disaster knocks down all of the rest of them. Now, I have said before that in a metaphysical understanding, you can discover that there really are no victims. But when you have the intersection with politics and metaphysics, then understand that a political animal like me, just because I appreciate that there are really no victims, that we're all here in a big hologram, a big playground, that we're all divine, that we all came here to share another growth experience together, just because I know that the person who seems to be suffering is actually an entity with infinite intelligence and power, doesn't mean that all of the causes that I used to support are no longer important. No, from a practical standpoint, there are plenty of things that I continue doing, and there are plenty of causes I continue to support. But the background understanding is that there is an alternative, and that's where my perceptual power is going to be drawn first, and that's where all of my intensity of thought is going to go, is to the alternative. And understand, you can remember that Jesus said, the poor will be with you always. Some entities that come into a physical form have a lesson they want to learn because they've been rich a million times, and you'll never understand it, but an entity can have a fascination with being poor. They can come here for that reason, and they want a lesson to be learned, and they're going to learn it. And so no matter how you try to help some people who are poor, they're going to remain poor because that's what they came here to do. Doesn't mean you're not going to be compassionate anymore, but you can understand. And the main understanding you get from the metaphysical intersection with politics is that every person you look at is another expression of the divine. And so as a human being, you can have utter contempt for them and not like them at all, just so long as you know you're looking at another version of God. And in some other lifetime that you did together, you may have been great buddies, or that may have been your mother, or you may have had a really good time together. Do you see what I mean? Once you do that, once you make the perceptual leap and see that the other person there wearing the human mask is actually a divine entity, then it's surprising how many things kind of disappear. How many disagreements, for example, and how many bridges across what seemed to be a pretty insurmountable gap, how many bridges develop. And it's surprising you can be friends with someone you didn't even like at all in the first place. And especially, I think this concept of diversity that I mentioned before, the one reason that I think so many people are hopeful about a new change of administration is that we can finally stop treating the rest of the world like enemies, because a lot of people like myself, and many of you probably, never viewed all of these people we're attacking and assaulting and considering enemies as enemies. Maybe some governments, yes, maybe some government leaders, but in general, no, not my enemies. They're just other people having an experience on the planet. Now, that leads me to the area of smoke screens, because basically, I would say that anybody who goes on a long metaphysical journey is, for example, going to develop their intuitive faculties pretty well, and they're going to be able to see things in people right away and perceive things about reality that they wouldn't perceive before. But even if you just learn these things without making some metaphysical journey, there's one thing I want to say about the current political life we have. In large part, since people have been manipulated by fear, we have had a continuing string of synthetic events over the recent years, well, not recent years, over recent decades, that have shaped public policy and that have taken away a lot of our freedoms. And you can go all the way back to the Kennedy assassination, and you can go all the way forward to 9/11. You know, most of you, that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't kill John Kennedy. At least about 80% of you realize that. One thing that might not be realized is that over the years, more scientists have been jumping into this whole area of conspiracy theories, because it is very obvious that manipulations are going on behind the scenes, and most of the events we see in the sanitized presentations on TV and in the print media have very little to do with the reality of the events. And so most people these days, whether they are conscious of how they got to that point or not, distrust most of what they see, because, and the media is in large part to blame, because the media no longer is getting to the bottom of stories, because over the last generation or so, the media has just become an outlet of the corporate empires. When you have basically 90% of all the media in the country owned by less than 10%, You're not going to have the same sort of media that you had when there was a robust challenging of government positions and when there was real investigative reporting going on in a lot of places. So I would say that these days, after going from being a political animal to a metaphysical student to a person who incorporates both of them, the thing that I see right now, and it doesn't matter whether you're on the right or the left, whether you're conservative or liberal, is that most of what you see as news is completely fake. Most of it is fake. Or if it's not fake, it's so sanitized that it tells part of the story and omits almost all of the real story. Let me just give you a few examples of where we see this now. We have hundreds of stories coming out showing studies showing that there is no real threat of global warming. And then if we discover, if we're careful and if we look into it, that most of them are funded by Exxon. We have examples of products that are available in the alternative health field. Things like, for example, nano silver is something that right now many consumer groups are trying to have banned. Nano silver, of course, is able to do wonders with all kinds of known viral elements and parasites and bacteria and everything else, and it's cheap, relatively cheap. But why are the consumer groups opposed to it? Well, mostly because they're not really consumer groups, they're fronts for pharmaceutical lobbies. Something pretending to be what it isn't. So whether it's an event like 9/11, where we know, because scientists tell us, that the temperature of melting steel and what happened there don't size up. Buildings did not crash to the ground because jets crashed into them. We know that from science. We know that from science, and those giant events have giant repercussions when they result in the Constitution of the United States being totally shredded because somebody says there is a threat and we are going to have to be on guard forever and forever. Look at Al-Qaeda as a principal example of what I'm talking about. People who are students of politics or history realize why, in the first place, bin Laden's people don't like the United States, just as they understand why a whole lot of people in a whole lot of places where they've been trampled on or where they've been abused by corporate entities based in the United States, it's pretty easy to see why they don't like us, but it's also easy to see, and it's been obvious forever, that Al-Qaeda is really about 2,000 people, or at least they were until we gave them power by making the rest of the world angry. We are talking about, or our government has been talking about sleeper cells in this country, and there aren't any sleeper cells in this country. I mean, people buy into myths without thinking about them at all, and that's what bothers me. Whether it's as simple as a so-called consumer uprising actually turning out to be something financed by corporations, or some giant event like the Waco events, like the burning, the bombing of the buildings in Oklahoma City. All of these events that lead us further and further away from a country where we're free and a country where we're governed by police instrumentalities, all of that stuff on inspection turns out to be largely bogus. And even if you believe that some of it is true, even if all of it were true, all of the government line about why certain things happened and how they happened, none of them would justify changing our form of government. And so, from a metaphysical standpoint, of course, it's always useful to be able to see through the bogus stories. And one thing that's happened in consciousness is that so many people see through the stories even if they don't know why they see through the stories, even if they're not educated in history or political science and not paying attention to current events. There's enough of an uprising in consciousness based on those people who are intuitive and those people who think it doesn't have to be this way, that there is a groundswell of people mistrusting. If you go back to the early days of the Kennedy assassination, there you had to have investigators write books, and then you eventually had people read books, and then you had more people file Freedom of Information suits, and then you got more evidence, and da-da-da-da. And to this very day, new evidence is being discovered all of the time because of the resources. The one thing that balances out the tendency to try to suppress legitimate information and to keep cover stories going is the birth of the World Wide Web and the extensive use of it to generate communication between interested people when some big deal happens. So 911 was different from the Kennedy assassination in that many people were instantly exchanging information about all of the this shouldn't be here aspects of that event in real time. And you had movies like Loose Change out on the streets in very short order, and you had a 911 commission that said one thing while you had citizens' bodies of inquiry that said something totally different. So there is a balancing going on globally in consciousness as people are rising up against the suppression that they see, and they're finally fed up enough with what happened under the last administration that they would like to have their rights back. It's interesting at the same time to be aware that some people having being born when they are and not having a sense of history don't think there's anything particularly unsavory about having their telephone conversations tapped even though they're not an international terrorist. Well, that just goes to show you how ironic it is. I mean, because a lot of people put their whole life on MySpace, so hey, they don't really care that somebody's tapping their phone. They'd probably make it easier for them. But you see what I'm saying. There are counterbalancing forces going on. There is hope at this particular time, both from a political standpoint and from a metaphysical standpoint, because consciousness is going in a direction of asserting the primacy of human rights over corporate rights and asserting the primacy of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness once more after it has been whittled away at for a long, long time, first by a military-industrial complex and then by a whole generation of other giant complexes that basically bought and sold influence in our government and took it away from us. And those of you who have lived outside of mass consciousness, i.e. living in a bubble reality, as I called it a while back, you are aware of the things that are going on, but you present with your life and with your success and with your thriving while others struggle, you have presented an alternate picture, and that alternate picture is part of where the whole universe wants to go right now, especially this species of human wants to go right now. And so I finally, after talking about politics and metaphysics and the intersection and the smokescreen that should bother people who are liberals and conservatives and right or left, I want to think in terms of possible futures, because one of the things that I always found enchanting years ago, listening to the channeled entity Bashar, who claimed to be from a future that coexisted at the same time as ours, because time's not linear. He talked about a race descended from humans, or partly humans, who lived in the future, and he talked about the fact that their society, if they want to call it a society, had dispensed with things like names. Since these entities knew who they were, even in their physical form, names were just a convenience. But more importantly, he talked about the fact that they had no economy because they created whatever they wanted and they bartered or exchanged or they shared the things they needed. And they had no need for a government because all people or all of this species, were self-governing. And it may seem way, 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 way in the future to think about all of us being self-governing. That's not the way to think about it. You yourself can be totally self-governing, and you can be totally independent of what happens in the political system or anywhere in life outside of yourself. And when you are self-governing, then you are taking one giant step for all of us. And we don't have to wait until everybody catches up to decide to be self-governing. And when you self-govern, and when you treat yourself with kindness and respect, and when you treat Gaia with respect and with honor, then you take a step in the direction of evolving the entire species. So, we're at a crossroads once again in history, and there's a lot of hope and optimism in the land that we're going to leave behind us, one of the sorriest chapters in our history, and we're going to try to do something again that honors our entire species. And I'll tell you what, when we do that, we redeem politics using an understanding of who it is that we really are. Because our political system, once again, can reflect all of us. And if it reflects all of us rather than some centers of profit that care less what they do to the rest of the world to generate their resources, well, it's going to be a lot better for all of us. And I'm not saying all corporations are bad. I'm not saying all people are bad. I'm saying we can all look out there at what could be, and we can embrace it. And when we embrace what could be, we're not going to have to fight each other for it. We're all going to thrive. Bye.
When the boys in the band never took a shine to you, 'cause you don't understand even half of what you think you do. And the boys tell me I should take a breather, but the boys never did understand you either. Well, the girls in the know tell me that you're devious, and they don't understand why you're waiting for me on the bus. Well, you sure don't drive and you're no mechanic, and the girls in the know look a little panicked. When a friend of a friend heard about us from the usual source, and a friend told a friend he was gonna recommend divorce. In the long run, sure, it was academic, but it does go to show that it ain't no picnic. Hurt me, Missy. When the boys in the band are giving us a dirty look, I suppose it's because we refuse to do it by the book. Everywhere that you look, there are feathers ruffled, 'cause the rules have